Carbon capture. You've definitely heard the term thrown around. It gets talked up as this amazing, high-tech fix for our climate problems, but it's also one of the most debated technologies out there. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise. We'll break down what it is, how it's supposed to work, and the massive, massive challenges it's up against. Okay, let's get right into it. To really get why we're even talking about carbon capture, you have to start with just how much energy we're using. And this quote from the ASEAN Center for Energy, wow, it really sets the scene. We are talking about one of the fastest growing parts of the world, and all that growth needs a truly staggering amount of power. And here's what staggering actually looks like. By 2050, the ASEAN region is projected to need 1,823 million tons of oil equivalent. That is a gigantic leap from where we are today. And it begs the question, right? Where on earth is all that energy going to come from? And that question, well, it brings us right to the heart of the region's energy dilemma. How do you fuel all that development? How do you lift millions of people into a better life without also locking in a future of climate disaster? It's a tough one. Because, the reality on the ground right now is pretty stark. Back in 2022, a whopping 82% of ASEAN's energy came from fossil fuels. And even if they go all in on renewables, the projections still show fossil fuels making up around 76% of the energy mix by 2050. That means a whole lot of CO2 is still going to be pumped into the atmosphere. And this, right here, shows you the two sides of that exact coin. On one side, you've got these incredible growing cities humming with all that energy. But on the other side, you have the consequences. Coral reefs, which are absolutely vital to the region, are just getting devastated by the warming and acidification caused by all those CO2 emissions. To really wrap your head around the scale of the problem, think of the atmosphere like a bathtub, okay? The faucet is on full blast. That's all of our emissions pouring in. And the drain, which is nature's ability to absorb CO2, it's tiny. It can't keep up. So to stop the tub from overflowing, we can't just turn the faucet down a little bit. We have to crank it way, way down by something like 80%. That means huge radical cuts in emissions. So, with fossil fuels likely to be a big part of the picture for decades to come, a lot of people are looking for a technological fix. And this is exactly where carbon capture enters the conversation. So, what is this stuff really? Well, first off, it's not just one thing. Think of it like two main paths you can take. First, there's CCS, which stands for carbon capture and storage. That's basically about grabbing CO2 from a smokestack and burying it deep underground, forever. Then there's CCU, carbon capture and utilization. That's about taking the captured CO2 and recycling it into something useful, like fuels or other chemical products. And here you can see that CCU idea in action. You capture the CO2 coming from a factory, you mix it with hydrogen made from clean electricity, and boom, you've created a new synthetic fuel. The big idea here is to create a circular carbon economy, turning a waste product into a valuable resource. Pretty neat, right? Now, that CCU recycling idea is really interesting, but to be honest, most of the big money and the massive projects are all focused on CCS, the permanent burial option. So how exactly do you take a gas out of a smokestack and lock it away deep in the earth? Well, it really boils down to three key stages. First, you have to capture the CO2, separating it from all the other gases at a power plant or a factory. Second, you transport it. Usually that means compressing it until it's almost a liquid and then pumping it through pipelines. And third, you sequester it, which is just a fancy word for injecting it deep, deep underground into very specific geological formations. And of course, you can't just stick it anywhere. The CO2 is injected into places like old, depleted oil and gas fields, which, hey, have already held oil and gas for millions of years, so they're a pretty good bet. Or it's put into what are called deep saline aquifers. These are layers of porous rock filled with super salty water way, way below any sources of fresh drinking water. So the whole concept sounds pretty logical, doesn't it? Capture, transport, store. So why aren't there thousands of these projects all over the world? Well, it turns out the reality of actually doing this is incredibly difficult. The reports that dig into this stuff boil all the problems down to four huge roadblocks: the cost, the time it takes, the sheer complexity of it all, and some gaps in technology. So let's start with the biggest one, the money. Here's the bottom line. Bolting carbon capture equipment onto a power plant is wildly expensive. We're talking about jacking up the cost of electricity by anywhere from 30 to 70%. And part of the reason is that the capture process itself uses a ton of energy. It's what they call an energy penalty. Without massive government subsidies or a really high price on carbon, the numbers just don't add up. And beyond the cost, these projects are just mind-bogglingly complex. Seriously, you have to build the capture plant, you have to get the rights to build hundreds of miles of pipeline, you have to scientifically prove a storage site is safe, and then you have to guarantee you can watch it for centuries to make sure nothing leaks. The timeline for even a single project can be more than a decade. But despite these enormous challenges, the sheer amount of CO2 still being produced means that governments, especially in places like ASEAN, feel like they just can't afford to ignore CCS, so they're actively trying to build a roadmap to actually make it work. And the framework they're proposing to make CCS a reality is basically built on 3 pillars: getting the policy right, creating a clear legal and regulatory system, and figuring out how to manage the storage sites safely. So that first pillar, policy, is all about closing that huge cost gap we talked about. This means governments have to step in with things like tax credits for every ton of CO2 you store, or grants to help build the facilities, or even putting a price on carbon that's so high it becomes cheaper to capture your emissions than to just release them. Then you've got the legal minefield. I mean, just think about it. Who actually owns the CO2 once it's buried? Who is legally on the hook if it leaks out 100 years from now? What if your pipeline needs to cross from one country to another? If you don't have clear answers to these questions, no company in their right mind is going to take on that kind of long-term risk. And this also shows you the incredible technical side of making these projects safe. It is not a pump-and-pray kind of operation. This grid of technologies shows all the different ways you have to monitor a site, from using seismic waves to check underground to sensors on the surface sniffing for leaks. It's a massive ongoing scientific effort just to prove a site is secure. Which, at the end of the day, leaves us with the fundamental question at the absolute center of this whole debate. The supporters say that CCS is a vital bridge, a tool that lets us clean up heavy industry while we build out a fully renewable world. But the critics? They worry it's a super expensive, unproven gamble that just gives the fossil fuel industry a license to keep operating for decades, delaying the shift we all know has to happen. So, what do you think?